Sometimes it shows the camera before the count.
Welcome to Argo Unpacked.
Hello.
Hello, Alex. Do you think you know everything, guys, about sync, Argo CD sync? Or do you think that you know all the available configuration and how powerful and flexible is the GitOps engine? I bet you don't. Welcome to the 30th episode of Argo CD Unpacked. I'm not Dan Garfield, as you probably expected. I'm Patroclus, and I'm replacing Dan for today's episode. With me, it's Alex Gaudreau. Alex, welcome to the show. Alex is, correct me if I'm wrong, a staff engineer at Intuit and one of the core maintainers for many, many years of Argo CD. And you are also one of the basic maintainers of GitOps Engine. So we've got the best guy to discuss about sync and all these powerful and dynamics and reveal us the secrets behind the sync operation. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you for the introductions. I won't say I'm the best guy for the job, but with the bug fix I've been handling recently, I for sure learned about GitOps Engine a lot. And there's a lot of complexity in the engine that powers Argo CD.
But it's funny because, sync is it's the most, let's say, popular Argo CD feature. And most people think that it should be like straightforward, which is, I mean, let's face it, it's the most easy thing to do in Argo CD applications. But, okay, when it comes to more complicated examples, it's not that easy, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure it started very simple, but over time we always add new features. And syncing in Kubernetes is a bit harder than just trying to kubectl apply all the resources at the same time to update your apps. So over time we add new features that increase the complexity. And with the nature of open source, you don't really have a owner that really is going to refactor the code all the times a new feature comes in. So over time, a complex algorithm like that, there's a bunch of ifs that gets added over and over again. So the complexity grow. And recently I tried to fix a bug in the engine, and it reached a point where it was in need of a refactor to kind of clean up the recent years of work and kind of go back to that initial algorithm that was actually pretty well designed initially.
So, we're not going to discuss how easy and what sync is. I believe that most of our people watching us, they already know. But from your side, what's the biggest misconception that you hear about Argo CD actually works, right? Because you talk with people, you're an active member of the community. What's the biggest misconception of Argo CD sync?
Misconception. I know people talk a lot about like dependencies, which resource depend on which resource. So basically having a deployment that depends on your service, that depends on maybe an ingress. But the dependency is really not flexible in Argo. Behind the scene, it's just an hard-coded list of resources that have priorities. And then there's that, let's say, lightweight feature that's called sync waves that has been built on top, but it requires a lot of manual configuration if you really want to create kind of dependencies between the resource and your applications. And sometimes you need to create these dependencies because we know that maybe updating a configuration of an ingress before other resource can cause an outage and things like that. So, yeah.
But there is some kind of, let's put it in the correct term, not dependency management, but there are some cool features of syncing Argo CD You gave a very interesting talk back in March in Amsterdam. I think it's one of the top most viewed talks on YouTube about sync process, right? And two of the key points of your presentation were about sync waves, right? And all the different things that we can configure in Argo CD to make people that want dependencies happy, right?
Yeah. So yeah, there was sync waves, and there's also another part of that presentation was the hook. So hooks are used a
Even
lot, and
better.
Argo CD is kind of backward compatible with the Helm hooks, um, and sometimes they are used when they shouldn't be used, or when they're unnecessary, and that also complex a lot this thing, because you can think that your sync becomes stateful, like you need to execute the hook really before going to before syncing your resources, but sometimes the hooks may need resources that are updated as part of the same sync. So the complexity grows with sync hooks, and sometimes you deploy an M chart, and the M chart have sync hooks written in the M chart, because those are important when it's deployed by Helm. But when Argo deploys it, it doesn't do a Helm install or Helm update. It actually just renders the resource and then deploy the resource the Argo way.
So one of the most common cases, one of the things that I usually hear when I talk to people is that they're using sync waves to run database migration before their application deploys. But is this like a common pattern? Do you think that database applications should be used like in sync waves, or as we say, Argo CD sync is eventual consistent. So your applications should have the required, let's say, health checks to make sure that your database is up and running, or your UI should have health checks about the API, and you don't need like sync waves or sync hooks. Like just deploy all your components and make sure that your application is ready to serve when the dependencies internally are up and running. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's an anti-pattern to deploy like, or use like hooks, or use sync waves to try to handle database and the order, make sure the database is deployed and synced before the app. I think that it's easy to do it in Argo, that's why people do it. But in my opinion, the right place to do it is as part of your CD process. So most people, they have their CI/CD pipelines. For me, update the database in a backward compatible way as part of your CD pipelines, because if you do it as part of the sync and then you need to roll back, now you cannot really roll back your commit, right? You need some manual actions. So it kind of doesn't make sense to try to automate it inside Argo, if then that breaks any possible GitOps rollback. So yeah, that's why I wouldn't do it like that. I would do it as part of my CD pipelines and deployment process, and then you always update your database. And I think that's someone from Octopus that gave a talk on like what's the right way to update the database in your applications. I think it was related to Argo rollout, but basically is you also need a rollout to have a database that is backward compatible with the previous version of your app. So that design also applies to Argo CD and the sync process.
That is true. Database migration is always a pain, even if you use Argo CD or not. It's the most painful part.
Yeah.
Have you seen any cases where using sync waves made things worse than not using them? because people, thought that sync hooks or sync waves, whatever it's like the silver bullet, and in the end they ended up with a very complex sync process configuration that was even worse than before.
Yeah, I think sync waves, I mean, if you change the default order that's hard coded in Argo CD with sync waves, so let's say you decide to sync a deployment before updating its service, like, so that sometimes people can do that. That doesn't really make sense, but most of the time they might not realize it. It's a misconfiguration, and that happens. So that's, I would say, the obvious way to mess up the sync with sync waves. But another one that is more hard for the user to see is the combination of health check and sync waves. So what's important to know is for each waves, before progressing to the next one, it needs all the resource of that wave to be healthy. And healthy is this concept that's specific to Argo CD. We have those Lua script health check on almost not every resource, but a lot of resources. So if you have a dependency where a resource from the first sync waves needs something to happen in the second sync waves to be healthy, then your sync will never get healthy the first time. So your sync will get stuck in progressing and eventually reach a timeout. And maybe now you can configure like retries so the sync works on the second try. But I would say sometimes complex applications can get into these tricky situations where there's kind of a dependency loop on resource needing each other and being on different waves.
Right. And now that you mentioned that syncing might get stuck, right? How do you usually approach a stuck sync that has no obvious, there's something really obvious that I need to fix? How do you usually debug like a sync that it's stuck, right? What's your process thinking or your your mental model? I mean, especially when you have like not complex but applications with several resources that needs to be eventually healthy.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the Argo UI is very powerful. I mean, you just click on the last sync, and usually you'll see, which resource is progressing, if your sync is progressing, and if your sync was terminated due to a timeout. You have the list of result, and this is ordered. So you can look at which resource were actually deployed, which were not updated, and then you can see where the sync stops, and you can investigate. So there's no, if you have an AI integration with Argo CD, I think that's able to do that for you now with the AI plugin that's in Argo Project Labs. But that's kind of how I would investigate my sync. It's very manual. And then, I mean, I know the concept of Argo CD. For an application developer that doesn't really understand these concepts, then they will probably need to reach out to internal supports or learn a lot more about the sync to be able to self-remediate the issue.
Cool. Okay, I have a couple of more questions about the let's say more than the basics, right? There are two very powerful, I would say, flags, right? The self-heal, okay, and auto sync. By default, they are not enabled. That's another discussion why they are not enabled by default, right? But it is what it is.
I mean, backward compatibility, right? That's turning on this flag now would break the world.
Yes.
Potentially.
You're right. Yeah. But um, should 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 all operators use self heal and auto sync? They are two completely different flags, but in combination, they can give you like the most safe environment, that your application is always synced with your source, which is Git, and you cannot do any manual changes. But should all operators use those, or it's like depending on?
I would say so. As autosync might depend, right? Autosync is something you turn. It depends on your legacy process. It depends on how you do CD. I know, like if you use application set and progressive sync, you need to turn off autosync because then it's the application set that manage the sync. Some companies have implemented that kind of progressive sync in an external controller as well, so they turn off autosync. Maybe it's their CD pipeline that triggers syncs and orders. So I would say auto sync. It's really you use it depending on your CD process. Self heal is the one that I find really interesting because I absolutely love it when it's enabled, and I agree with you. Then you're sure that any change in Kubernetes are reverted and that your desired state is sync. But I think to enable that, you need really good monitoring on Argo CD when self-heal is actually executed. Because on my previous job, we turned self-heal on by default. And eventually, as people were adopting Argo CD, people build controllers, and you get those kind of conflict where the controller updates the resource, Argo fights back, reverts the state, and the controller re-updates it. And with Kubernetes and the reconciliation loop, that happens really fast. And sometimes you won't even see your application
Exactly.
status change from sync to out of sync because it happens too fast. Um, and you just see the performance metric of Argo CD kind of go wild. But if you're not looking at those, you just see over time the performance of Argo degrades little by little because of a few applications and that self-heal feature. So you need to monitor the Argo CD performance. And one thing that I absolutely recommend when people turn on self-heal is to have that setup of, using the Argo CD metrics to monitor which apps are flipping state. And if an app goes from LT to out of sync like too much per
Yeah.
minute, you need to send an alert. But you need to send that alert to the development team, not to the team that operates Argo CD, or they're
Yeah.
gonna get spam. And to be able to do that, you need a whole other setup of being able to distribute alerts to the right team on their applications. You need to have rules to maybe have like a Slack channel or alert ID if you use PagerDuty, like service keys as annotations on your app, so you can distribute the alerts to the right teams. And not everyone have this set up from day one. So if you turn on self-heal, you should also consider creating that setup. Yeah.
That's a very good recommendation. I mean, I believe most operators out there do have metrics that they monitor, but that flip that you said, that changing the state super fast, because I second that. I mean, if you have the auto heal, you may not realize that there was a change and was reverted. It's like super fast, and if you don't have a good monitoring system with pragmatic metrics, then probably you're going to lose everything, right? How how about? I mean, again, there's no silver bullet. Its environment has its own configuration, its own characteristics, but usually, I mean, what we do is like self heal. It's I would say very good in production environments in your clusters, But then you have dev or staging that you want to do, like, usually developing a new service, you want to do like manual changes on your cluster, or play around with some resource limits. Self-heal doesn't make that sense in non-production environments. Would you agree on that? Or again, it depends. If you want to have like a staging very close to production, then probably they should have the same configuration.
Yeah, I think it depends too. If you have like auto sync enabled everywhere, then I assume like companies will have very good, uh, efficient GitOps workflows. So
True,
you
true.
might be able to use GitOps to do a like real quick PR. You don't need approval, but it needs to be GitOps. In that case, it's really
Yeah.
not a problem. But one thing I like recently of Argo compared to maybe a few years ago is the fact that it's easier now to like go in the UI and toggle auto sync off,
Yeah.
and then you can basically update your application and not care about self heal and what's the other one, uh, pruning.
It's pruning. Oh, that's another story.
Because before, like when you turn off auto sync, if those two configuration were true, you will lose them, right? Now it
Yeah.
persists the state of the object. So when you turn auto sync back on, it keeps the self heal and pruning configuration if they were enabled. So that little change, I think it's really nice, and it helps a lot with toggling auto sync on and off. And another thing that I think, if you have that monitoring setup where you can send alerts to devs, one thing I did in the past is, let's say an application is out of sync for 24 hours, you can send a, not an alert, but a warning level message to the team that owns this application, just to say like, maybe you turned off auto sync, now you want to turn it back on for the next devs that will come after you, because
Yeah.
sometimes you toggle auto sync off and then you do your work, you complete your task, and jump to something else, you forgot that you had to turn it back on.
Okay, you mentioned pruning, right? It's another really powerful feature, but it's dangerous, right? I mean, I've seen Argo CD installations going, under fire because of wrong pruning configuration. Are there
Yeah.
any safeguards that we can recommend to the people who are watching us, or
Yeah,
just read the docs, guys, and make sure you know what you are doing?
and it's sometimes Argo is only as good as your desired manifest, right? Argo
Right.
helps you in applying your desired state, but if your desired state has some gaps, then Argo cannot do really a lot about it. And prune, it's interesting because you also have that prune last configuration.
Right.
And sometimes you want to prune the resource first because you need to delete the resource to create another one. Let's if the two resource, they consume the same underlying resource, and that thing cannot be consumed by two parents. Um, so you want to prune it first. But sometimes you also want to prune last an object because you want to create a new one first. Let's say the
A new
case of
one,
an
yeah, yeah.
ingress, right? If you create a new ingress, you want the new ingress to be created first, and then you delete the existing one. But the two ingress cannot use uh, the same host sometimes. So in this situation, really, we cannot make a decision. Oh, let's delete all ingress first or let's delete all ingress last. It really depends on the desired state. So prune can be dangerous, but in general, I like prune to always be turned on. but then people need to define like that prune last annotation on the resource that matters. And if you're not able to do that part because you don't like your maybe platform team doesn't really know or there's no owner, then it's safer to just turn prune to false. And if you have that alerts I said that sends a notification to the teams when the app is out of sync for a day, then maybe a day after they're like, oh, my app is out of sync because some resource weren't pruned. They can go in the UI, they can perform the manual action, and they can validate now uh, if the resource should be pruned correctly.
True. Yeah, but the idea is to minimize the UI interaction. I mean, that's the GitOps standard, right? I mean, yeah, Argo CD has a very powerful UI. You can do almost everything, either in the UI or the CLI. They have more or less the same features, but ideally, not so many UI interactions should be done by devs, especially production.
Ideally, you have a lot of validation before merging that GitOps pull request. Like you can see the diffs with diffs preview, but it's hard to know like, hey, are my configuration gonna cause an outage before actually syncing them? That's why every company almost have that stage environments, right? That tries to catch these problems.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's not enough load. The stage environment is not really in sync with production. So it helps, but there's always gaps that might happen in production when you sync your resource. It's like you need to know what you're doing. There's no way around it.
Always.
You're
Yeah.
changing like critical configuration, especially everything related to network. Like if you change an HPA config, it's not that bad. The rollback can work. But if you change like networking configurations, it's much harder to figure out how your traffic is going and flowing to your pods. And when it breaks, it breaks. It's not always DNS. Sometimes it's the user using Argo.
You mentioned, Alex, about diffs. Okay, it's something that not many people are not familiar. They're familiar, but they are not familiar with the different strategies that Argo CD can generate a diff. Right? Can you tell us a bit more, or what's the default strategy, and when people should switch strategies, and what's the benefit of one against the other one?
Yeah, the diff strategy, that's something totally different from the sync process, but it is.
Yeah, but it's very useful, right?
It is
It's very useful.
And the history with Kubernetes also changed how the diff work. So you started with like client side applied, and that last I always forget the name, last applied configuration, I think, that contains the desired state object that has been applied to Kubernetes, and then the diffing algorithm used that to figure out which config to check to apply in Kubernetes. Now they added manage fields, and then that works with server-side diff, and then controllers can own specific fields. Honestly, I think the latest is the greatest, so people should all switch to server-side apply. But it's harder than just switching a boolean in the config and switch. Now everything is server-side applied, right? Because then you will have conflicts. Sometimes controllers will own a config that Argo should own, and they will show the diff when there's actually, or they won't show the diff when there's actually a diff. And we had an issue when enabling server-side diff. And the solution was basically opening the CRD, looking at how the CRD built, and the field in the CRD, I think, needed to be atomic instead of a map. So like you cannot ask any application developer to figure out, oh yeah, that field is atomic in the CRD, that's why my diff doesn't show in Argo. That's
Yeah, it's not
It goes
at,
into the
at
nitty
all.
gritty of Kubernetes. So the diff is really complex on its own. Yeah, it's really hard to figure out. And if someone is great at understanding how the kind of diff, client side diff, strategic merge diff, then that's a very good knowledge to have.
Right, right. Okay, well, there is one more feature that I do like, although I'm not using it a lot because for other reasons. There are the sync windows, right? They are very powerful. I like them because it's like a um, a safety net. But hey, guys, during that time, whatever you do, we're not going to deploy anything. Relax, okay? Any, you know, tips on how to use them or not to use them? I mean, apparently people, the most common scenario is, well, guys, during the weekend,
Yeah,
don't sync anything. But I assume there are more, advanced scenarios or cases that you have seen.
I've seen, I would say the most complex sync window scenario I've seen was like an app that was deployed in like all over the world, so different time zone. And so the team was like merging a change to their apps, so all production would update. But then, if it's business hour for North America, you don't want to update North America. So the sync windows was super complex because it needed the time zone of every region where the cluster was. Uh, it's it's a feature that's there, but from my experience, it's very hard to like configure well. It's really manual, right? you
It
you
is.
have to enter all your manual configuration, all your manual windows. So it works, but in general, I would say just sync when
Don't,
sync. Yeah, merge
don't
your
merge.
when you're ready.
Yeah,
Don't merge
right.
private, or if it's a change that you have high confidence in,
Yeah.
it's fine, merge whenever, right? If you
But
use Argo rollout and you just have a simple microservice, you're confident that you have the right canary deployment configuration, deploy your app,
exactly. Yeah.
and worst case,
It will be
the
rolled back.
will
Just
get the
have a
current,
metric and roll
roll
back.
back to the
Yeah.
current version. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, one question that during community meetups and stuff, they ask me is, okay, I'm using Argo CD the last XYZ months, and we have tested it with a few applications. With a few is like a very small portion of the amount of the real application in the production. And the concern is how and if the sync process is affected when we scale up Argo CD to hundreds or thousand applications to the whole company. Because when someone evaluates Argo CD, they pick up, I don't know, a few dozens of applications, within the team. It works fine, great. And then when you scale it up, then nothing works as the no, nothing works. That is just like uh, but is sync affected by, I don't know, when Argo CD is scaled up, and what are the critical configuration that we should keep in mind?
I wouldn't say that the sync is can be affected. Like when Argo starts to sync, it applies the resource and waits. So the only way
It's
this
Kubernetes stuff after that. It's
sorry,
whatever Kubernetes will. After the Argo CD starts the syncing, then Argo waits until Kubernetes give you
yeah.
the green light. I'm ready. Go ahead.
And if you have a very simple sync, like one sync waves, no hooks, then Argo just applies all the resource at the same times. And then it's just a matter of are the resources LT. And I think, yeah, actually for only one sync waves, no hooks, it just applies the resource. If it was able to do the Kubernetes API call, the sync is done. So the sync process on its own is really not affected by the load. So that's a good thing about Argo. It's even when things are not going well, Argo itself is not going to mess up with your application and create an outage. Like if GitHub is down, then your
Yeah.
app is not down. It
Yeah.
won't sync. If you have a problem generating the manifest because your M chart is too big or the load on the repo server is too big, then it doesn't generate the manifest, so it fails before syncing.
Before. Yeah.
So it's very rare that like Argo will fail in the middle of a sync, and you won't be able to do anything. If you have a sync fail, it's possible that half the resource in your application are updated, but doing so shouldn't cause a cloud native application to fail, right? You shouldn't expect two different Kubernetes resource to always always be applied at the same time.
So it looks like sync is the safest, let's say, operation in Argo CD. So either something before sync is slowing down, like reconciliation, for instance, or after the sync, like, I don't know, probably Kubernetes cluster is having memory issues or other resource problems, and it takes time to deploy the whole application, right? So it's like syncing is quite safe.
Yeah, I would say that most of the time it's going to be the reconciliation loop that fails before the sync loop, because if you think about the load for maybe 10,000 reconciliations, there's going to be one sync. So the load and the pressure is really on that reconciliation loop.
That should be another episode. I mean, reconciliation fights are the most difficult. So we can have another whole episode about reconciliation and how you can scale up your Argo CD cluster.
And it's the most important thing to look at. If you operate an Argo instance and you wonder which metrics you should look at or what dashboard to build, look at the applications that are reconciled the most. They're most likely the problematic one, and then look at the application that takes the most time to reconcile. Then you're probably gonna find like, oh, I have an M chart that takes like 5 minutes to generate. Maybe there's a problem. So just looking at the basic reconciliation metrics and addressing those issues makes your team that operates Argo a lot more proactive, and you're gonna fix so many issues before they happen. So it's really good practice to monitor these aggressively.
So you are, like we discussed, you are one of the most active maintainers, and you know probably the syncing code maybe best than most of the maintainers. If there was only one feature that you would like to change and break backwards compatibility, only one.
Good question. I never consider it because that's not really something.
It would be the self-heal that we discussed, or something else?
It will be what?
The self-heal that we discussed previously, or something else?
A feature.
You have the chance, to change something, and nobody will complain that, hey, this guy's Argo CD break the new that lovely feature. Would it be that?
I'm not sure I know how to answer, because actually when I look at the code, I don't even consider that question because it's not something possible. There's always going to be someone that's
imaginary.
I was using this exact feature and I'm relying on it, and now it's been removed. That's things that are super hard to do. The only thing that comes to my mind right now is actually a new feature that I don't think I created an issue. I don't know if there's an issue on it, but we have a timeout, on the whole application sync.
Sure.
But that timeout is on the controller level. So you can say like, if a sync is in progress, like after an hour, just kill it, right? Because it's probably never gonna end. So you terminate it after an hour. and that timeout is after the application retries. So an app
Oh,
that fails will retry, but the timeout is encompass all that work. There's no timeout per sync, like at the
per
lower.
retry.
Yeah. So let's say it could be 10 minutes. An app should be like the resource during a sync should be healthy for 10 minutes. If it failed, try the sync over. I don't know if it would be useful, but I know that when I was looking at the code and looking at that like sync timeout variable, I was like, well, is this happening per sync? Is it after all the retries? It's weird that it's like at the controller level, it cannot be configured per application. So that kind of feature, that kind of the controller timeout feature, I think it could be very useful for teams, but
Yeah,
I don't know because
could
it
be.
would have been useful. Probably someone would have tried to implement it. So I don't know.
That is true. Um, you mentioned retries. Do you think they are useful? I mean, if an application fails to sync, what would the retry change in
Mm,
the way that application will sync the second one, right?
well, we do. I think it's really useful, and because we're a GitOps tool, and we have to try to be eventually consistent. So yes, there's the obvious, like, oh, the Kubernetes API server of my target cluster was down at that moment. So you have your transient errors. So then the retry is super useful. It failed, it's going to work the second time. Sometimes people are doing some weird stuff in their application and
Yeah,
they're like gonna sync a namespace as part of their application, and then there's another controller somewhere that will discover that namespace, reconcile, maybe add some resource quota or things like that, and after that, now the app is able to deploy.
to do this.
But
I,
like it's gonna fail the first time because that other controller that needs to reconcile is not gonna kicking right away. There's a delay. So in this situation, to try to be a little more eventually consistent, we need to retry. And there's also, I mean, another feature I need to talk about is that I really love, and it's someone from the community, not a maintainer, that implemented it. I think it's the refresh feature on the retry. So in your retry configuration, you can set refresh true. What that does is on the next retry, it will pick up the latest commit from your branch. Because normally what happens when you start the sync,
right.
if it fails, it retries, but it retries
It's
the
the
same
same,
commit
the
shot.
same commit,
Yeah,
right?
because you don't, it's not an explicit operation that you want to always take the latest on your branch. You want to retry the exact same operation that you that you triggered. But if you need a commit to fix your desired state, but your sync is always retrying forever on the old commit, then you need to do the manual action to click terminate so auto sync discover that there's a new commit and fix it. So I really like people that have that. They absolutely rely on eventual consistency. So the app retries forever all the time, but then they have that refresh true option to always pick up the latest commit in case the desired state needs to be fixed. And if you do that,
That's
you monitor, you need to
again
monitor
monitor. Yeah,
each retries because then can have like infinite loops there.
that's a very cool feature. I forgot about this refresh button, but yes, it's very useful. But so there is no distinction in retries if it's a transient error or if it's an error in the application configuration, right?
No,
That might be a nice feature add-on.
I, It could be, but then, as I said, like we try sync are like less than 1% of Argo's resource usage.
Yeah.
So,
That's
like
right.
trying to limit the number of sync that happen, it actually doesn't really it doesn't consume that many resource. Maybe if you're doing infinite sync and it's like starts hammering
True.
the Kubernetes API, there's a problem, but sync already has a backup mechanism. So eventually, even if you keep calling Kubernetes API, it shouldn't cause
Yeah,
too many
it
problems.
degrades. Right,
But
right.
then that retry configuration is on the application. Maybe the application developers can change it so they won't understand that maybe if they
The
back
retry
up,
mechanism.
only wait
Yeah.
1 second, that actually
Try
has
again.
implication on their cluster.
Hopefully they're not. Are there any other cool features in the GitOps engine that are not that popular, and they make a huge difference when someone tries to use them?
Do you have one in mind? I'm scared to like after this meeting, I'll be like, oh, I should have said that.
No
Uh,
worries, because I
I
think we
don't know.
covered most of them in the GitOps engine, right?
I honestly think like, well, actually, the resource health, like that L check that we have, it's actually a GitOps engine feature because
It
it's
is.
yeah. So it's not just an Argo CD feature. And if you compare Argo and plain Kubernetes and try to figure out like if your deployment is LD in Kubernetes, you have to go look at the condition. You have to go investigate a bunch of different things. The just the health check on their own, they are super useful to Kubernetes. So like if I had a wish, that would be to have these health check actually like be native in Kubernetes. So it's much easier to know if just have one
Yeah.
flag that tells you like is my Kubernetes resource LT or not. But I think it's one of the most important feature of Argo CD, and that's actually a GitOps Engine feature.
And I think you already mentioned that Argo CD has, I don't know, at least hundreds of or thousands probably implemented health checks, right? And from what we see, people are adding health checks for any given resource that we don't even know, or you
Yeah.
can't know all available resource over there. And it's a very powerful mechanism that you can write your own health check, and then Argo CD automatically has its own mechanism to deploy it and do its magic, and then wow, see your component with that resource and check
And
its healthiness.
and the only thing we see is like L check on other open source resource. But many company they build their own operator,
Their
they
own,
build their own
yes.
PRD. So then they in their private deployment they have that L check configuration in the Argo config map. So I think we only see the tip of the iceberg actually.
Cool. Okay, let me answer. There's a question about sync windows. How much should we use them? Is there a too much sync windows, or it's okay? Use them as long as they work for you.
Yeah, as much as you need them. Like I would say use them, don't use them because of corporate policy. Like if the company say, oh, let's not deploy, we cannot deploy on Friday, or people say don't deploy during business hours. I'd rather deploy, I don't understand that, I'd rather deploy during business hour when I'm at my desk looking at everything than like deploy at 8 p.m. and have to like work late evening just to do a deployment that I already know is safe. Because if it wouldn't be safe, I would be the one saying, oh, I'm going to deploy that in the evening.
Right.
So, like, don't implement those kind of corporate policy inside Argo just for the sake of having policies that dates from maybe 5, 10 years ago where deploying software was a lot more dangerous, let's say.
Well, I remember I was working in the past for a company. Let's say their product was some kind of a merchandise thing that it was accepting 1000x times the traffic during the Black Friday period.
Oh yeah.
And 5 days before Black Friday and 5 days after, all GitHub repositories were actually blocked. You couldn't even merge. You couldn't do anything. Just to make a fun of how sync windows can help on that edge cases, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, we have the same thing at Intuit, where when it's tax seasons, right? Everyone are waiting till the last minute to do their taxes. So am I.
So you know the pain.
So yeah, you shouldn't, like, that cold freeze concept exists at most company, but maybe don't implement cold freeze with like sync windows. I don't think that like implement that at the pull request level. If you're doing GitOps, like block all PRs to be merged, but then you may need to sync stuff in Argo to do a hotfix and things like that. So trying to handle that with sync windows, I would say it's not the right tool for the job.
Cool. We have a couple of minutes left, Alex. Now, can you give us any inside information about what's in the roadmap for sync? Maybe something about performance or some cool feature that you don't want to completely reveal. Just give us, a sneak peek of what's coming.
Oh, I don't really know about sync, but don't be too disappointed, because actually, in the last...
But GitOps, maybe GitOps Engine, or whatever you want.
Because in the last couple of months, I've actually switched to UI, believe it or not, going from like core deep backend to UI.
Why, Alex? Why?
Right. I have an AI to help me, and I'm super glad that it's the first time we talk about AI after 50 minutes.
True.
But like with an AI, it's much easier to actually do UI change in Argo, and I think UI is what makes Argo, one of the things that makes Argo so great, but we didn't have really that knowledge in the maintainers pool. Now with the AI, it's a lot easier to understand how everything works and manipulate all these CSS and React. And there's a really nice feature that's coming. Hopefully, the PR is not yet merged, but I'm just gonna say that we had the application set UI in 3.5. We may have another interesting UI in 3.6, and a lot of like small UI enhancement was done to. If you look at the CD demo instance that's running on master, so what 3.6 will be, and you go to the settings page, it'll like the project page, the repository page, all that. Now they all have like paging and filters, so it's much easier to consume when you need to consume them. But stay tuned on what's coming on the UI side, because Argo is starting to look a lot nicer.
Yes, amazing. Well, Alex, thank you so much. I believe that we covered almost everything about sync that people need to know, should know, or avoid, or must have configuration. Thank you so much, guys. It was Alex from Intuit, and I'm Patroklos replacing Dan for this week's episode. Thank you so much. Subscribe on ArgoUnpacked.com and don't miss an episode. And see you again in the next episode. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Bye, see you.
Argo Unpacked. Stay synced.